name's Raymond Antrobus. I'm a poet from London, and yeah, it's been an honour to be here. I think I'm just going to begin by talking about, following on from Jeffrey's phenomenal talk. And this week I was talking with Jeffrey about time, about place, about poems and monuments and sound. And one of the questions Jeffrey and I have been asking is, can a poem be a monument? I'm going to read a selection of poems from the Perseverance that perhaps attempt to be monuments in their own right, pillars of language, holding up names, places, and points in time. So I'm going to read the opening from the book, The Perseverance. What I should say is, I wrote this poem when my dad just recently passed away, and I ended up in Barcelona, and I went to see Gaudi's Cathedral, and in there I was asked to take the audio guide, and I was told in the audio guide about the history of different sections of the cathedral, how it was built, what its function is, and it instructs you at one point to look up into a particular section of the roof and shout or sing and be vigilant of how the sound moves in this space, because Gaudi believed that this particular part of the church was the perfect container of sound, meaning whoever experienced sound in this particular place would be elevated by the experience, and they would get to experience sound as angels. And I was having this experience artificially through hearing aids, and then wondering if we, deaf people, are included in this idea of holy sound and divinity. Echo 1. My ear amps whistle as if singing to echo, goddess of noise, the ravelled knot of tongues, of blaring birds, consonant crumbs, of dull doorbells, sound swamped in my misty hearing aid tubes. Gaudi believed in holy sound and built a cathedral to contain it, pulling hearing men from their knees as though deafness was a kind of atheism. Who would turn down God? Even though I have not heard the golden decibel of angels, I have been living in a noiseless palace where a doorbell is pulsating light, and I am able to answer. What? A word that keeps looking in mirrors in love with its own volume. What? I am a one-word question, a one-man patience test. What? What language would we speak without ears? What? Is paradise a world where I hear everything? What? How will my brain know what to hold if it has too many arms? 3. The day I clear out my dead father's flat, I throw away boxes of moulding LPs, Garvey, Malcolm X, Mandela, speeches on vinyl. I find a TDK cassette tape on the shelf. The smudged green label reads Raymond speaking. I play the tape in his vintage cassette player and hear my 2-year-old voice chanting my name, Antrob, and Dad's laughter crackling in the background, not knowing I couldn't hear the word bus and wouldn't until I got my hearing aids. Now I sit here listening to the space of deafness. Antrob, Antrob, Antrob. 4. And if you don't catch nothing, there's something wrong with your ears. They've been tuned to the wrong frequency. So maybe I belong to the universe underwater, where all songs are smeared wailings for Salacia, goddess of salt water, healer of infected ears, which is what the doctor thought I had, since deafness did not run in the family but came from nowhere. So they syringed olive oil and salt water, and we all waited to see what would come out. And no one knew what I was missing until a doctor gave me a handful of Lego and said to put a brick on the table every time I heard a sound. After the test, I still held enough bricks in my hand to build a house and call it a sanctuary. Call it the reason I sat in saintly silence during my grandfather's sermons where he preached the good news I only heard as Babylon's babbling echoes. So some of the discussion earlier that spoke about spaces of resistance, and there's, I'm going to bring this poem in. This poem is called Two Guns in the Sky for Daniel Harris. And since this week, speaking with Jeffrey as well, he's told me about the names of other people, other deaf people who have lost their lives in a similar way to Daniel Harris. And this seems to be like an ongoing kind of issue that's not being addressed. And so it makes me think about the kind of danger that we're all in as a society if we don't understand each other. And so just to say, when I was in the States, I was in New York quite a few years ago, and I was trying to learn little pieces, little words in American Sign Language. And on this particular day, I happened to have learned the word alive. Alive. In BSL, it's slightly different, live or alive. So I remember learning that word and then learning about this. Two guns in the sky for Daniel Harris. When Daniel Harris stepped out of his car, the police officer was waiting, gun raised. I used the past tense, so this is irrelevant in Daniel's language, which is sign. Sign has no future or past tense, it is a present language. You are never more present than when a gun is pointed at you. What language says this if not sign? But the police officer saw hands waving in the air, fired, and Daniel dropped his hands, his chest bleeding out to the concrete meters from his home. And I'm in New York coffee house reading this news on my phone when a black policewoman walks in, two guns on her hips, my friend next to me reading the comic section, Black Lives Matter. Now what could we sign or say out loud? When the last word I learned in American Sign Language was alive. Alive. Both thumbs pointing at your lower abdominal. Index fingers pointing up like two guns in the sky. So something else that me and Jeffrey have been talking about throughout the week is also about education and the kind of spaces in which education happen, kind of institutions in which we learn and we acquire our information and the history of our nation and of our people. And I'd come across a poem by a prominent English poet called Ted Hughes, who in the late 70s was commissioned by the National Theatre in London. And the commission for him was go and find out how people live without language. And so Ted Hughes took it upon himself to go and visit deaf schools in London with the premise or the idea that deaf people don't have language. So he sat down in this deaf school in his classroom and he wrote words, notes on his observations. So I wrote a poem that responds to that poem, taking pieces of language that Ted Hughes used to describe deaf children. And some of those words, I'll read some of the examples he used. Unaware, simple pause, lacking a dimension, removed from the vibration of air, alert, simple, lacking a subtle waving aura of sound and responses to sound. So I've kind of appropriate that and just kind of revise this poem in a way to speak or redirect back to Ted Hughes, who's projecting outward. I'm trying to project it back into him. And if you know Ted Hughes' poetry, you'll know that a lot of his work, he uses a lot of nature-based extended metaphors. And because I happened to be in New Orleans when I wrote this poem, I was right by the Mississippi River. So I just turned and saw the river and I thought, okay, I'm going to personify the river to speak back to Ted Hughes. I should say that I put the poem, Ted Hughes' poem, in the book, but then I was threatened with a lawsuit by the Ted Hughes estate. So I had to change how I was going to put it in the book. So I just put it in the book like this, completely redacted. So the shape of the poem is still visible, but every line is, the whole poem is redacted. And I share this poem with deaf young people, and I've gone into schools around the UK talking about this. And I had one student who, when he saw this page, asked me to turn the page this way, like that. And then he said that when you look at it this way, it looks like the audio channels on his audiologist's computer when he's getting his cochlear implants programmed. And I love that as an example of the kind of accidents or understandings that can happen in the classroom, almost accidentally, when we choose to respond to the things that harm us creatively. You never know, and when you're able to model it and share it, you never know what kind of new information or new ideas will come from that. So I just read my response. After reading Deaf School by the Mississippi River. No one wise calls the river unaware or simple pools. No one wise says it lacks a dimension. No one wise says its body is removed from the vibration of air. The river is a quiet breath taker, gargling mud. Ted is alert and simple. Ted lacked a subtle, waving aura of sound and responses to sound. Ted lived through his eye, but I, the colossal currents from the bridge, I, riverboats ghosting a geography of fog. Mississippi means big river, named by French colonizers. The natives laughed at their arrogant maps, conquering wind and marking mist. The mouth of the river laughs. A man in a wetsuit emerges, pulls misty goggles over his head. Couldn't see a thing, he breathes heavily. My face was in darkness. No one heard him. The river drowned him out. So I'm going to read the title poem, The Perseverance. The Perseverance is the name of the pub that my dad used to drink in when I was a kid. And when he passed away, I ended up having a lot of memories of actually being left outside this pub in Hackney, and it would be usually on the weekends when my dad would be looking after me. But at the time, he was struggling with alcohol. I guess he was an alcoholic at this time, so he would go to the pub, leave me outside, go and just disappear for hours. And there's, while I was writing this book, I kind of checked into therapy. I needed to look at other ways to, I think, manage some of the trauma, I suppose, that was provoked in me while writing these poems. And there was an interesting kind of idea where my therapist said to me, maybe some of your anxiety is rooted in this idea of, you never know what kind of version of your parent is gonna present themselves, like the sober, the drunk, they can be two very different people. My dad was certainly like that. My dad also loved Peter Tosh, one of the whalers. And so this poem begins with a Peter Tosh line in which he says, "Love is the man overstanding." And overstanding is a Jamaican term, which just basically means to go beyond understanding. I more than understand, I overstand. Love is the man overstanding, Peter Tosh. I wait outside the Perseverance. Just popping in here a minute, I'd heard him say it many times before, like all kids with a drinking father, watch him disappear into smoke and laughter. There is no such thing as too much laughter, my father says, drinking in the Perseverance until everything disappears. I'm outside counting minutes, waiting for the man, my father, to finish his shot and take me home before it gets dark. We've been here before. No such thing as too much laughter unless you're my mother without my father, working weekends while the Perseverance spits him out for a minute. He gives me 50p to make me disappear. 50p in my hand, I disappear like a coin in a parking meter before the time runs out. How many minutes will I lose listening to the laughter spilling from the Perseverance while strangers ask, "Where is your father?" I stare at the doors and say, "My father is working." Strangers who don't disappear but hug me for my Perseverance. Dad said this will be the last time before of a TV's spilled canned laughter, us on the sofa in his council flat, knowing any minute the yams will boil, any minute I will eat again with my father, who cooks and serves laughter, good as any Jamaican who disappeared from the island I tasted before overstanding our heat and Perseverance. I still hear popping in for a minute, see him disappear. We lose our fathers before we know it, and I am still outside the Perseverance, listening for the laughter. I'm going to try something new. I've got another book coming out in November, and just again thinking about poems as monuments. During the lockdown, I somehow it occurred to me that I had never visited the graves of my great grandparents who were buried in England, and so I sought them out and I went and visited their graves. And so this poem is called Sutton Road Cemetery, and inspired partly by the Irish poet Evan Boland. His mother had driven him back to London in the half-light. He sighed in the passenger seat. They stopped by the Southend seas as the wind picked up and clouds thinned into English women. All the stones had said nothing of their names as he skimmed them wide across the waves. Earlier, when he'd found the grave of his great-grandmother by the elderberry tree, it was the one time he'd wanted someone white to appear and ask where he was from. It would have been no skin off him to point at her stone and say, "Here." So I'm just going to read one more poem, and this poem, I guess, we're talking quite a lot about the kind of questions that we can ask ourselves going into our future, or even the kind of questions we ask ourselves when we look at our own history, and how much of our own history is emotional history. And so I guess this last poem, the question I was asking myself was, where did language begin for me? In a very literal and practical sense, where did it begin? And some of my earliest memories are of my dad reading to me. And there was a children's picture book called Happy Birthday Moon, which I loved. And it told the story about this bear who lives out in the forest. And this one particular night, the bear stands on top of a hill looking out over the forest and the valleys. And the bear says, "It's my birthday." And the bear's voice echoes through the valley, and he hears the echo, "It's my birthday." And so everything the bear says, he hears again, looks up at the moon, and says, wow, it's the moon's birthday as well. So the whole book is this story about this bear enjoying his birthday, his nighttime birthday party with the moon. And it's such a great poetic device, I think, the more I thought about that. Particularly like a deaf poetic device, because it employs repetition. And so obviously, when you're deaf in the way that I am, in the way that I still very much function in the hearing world with hearing aids and lip reading, you're relying on repetition as well. So I thank you so much for listening. And I hope that this poem also makes you think about where language began for you. Happy birthday, Moon. Dad reads aloud. I follow his finger across the page. Sometimes his finger moves past words tracing white space. He makes the moon say something new every night to his deaf son who slurs his speech. Sometimes his finger moves past words tracing white space. Tonight he gives the moon my name, but I can't say it. His deaf son who slurs his speech. Dad taps the page, says, try again. Tonight he gives the moon my name, but I can't say it. I say, Raymond Antrobus. He laughs. Dad taps the page, says, try again. But I like making him laugh. I say my mistake again. I say, Raymond Antrobus. He laughs, says, Raymond, there's something else. I like making him laugh. I say my mistake again. Raymond Antrobus. What else will help us? He says, Raymond, there's something else. I'd like to be the moon, the bear, even the rain. Raymond Antrobus. What else will help us hear each other, really hear each other? I'd like to be the moon, the bear, even the rain. Dad makes the moon say something new every night, and we hear each other, really hear each other. As Dad reads aloud, I follow his finger across the page. Thank you. I think that was, if there's any Q&A, any questions. It'd be good to meet you and be in conversation with some of you out there. Hey.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
It was really touching. Sorry, I'm trying to get somewhere where the audio won't over.
Okay.
One of the questions is, how did you choose what form to present your poems in?
Okay. How do I choose what forms to present my poems in? If I'm honest, I rarely think about form in the early stages of a poem. Even this week, the stuff I've been writing, it's been very much kind of free flow, collecting images, things I've seen. So usually I'll have like a first draft, which is very much kind of written on the nerve, spur of the moment, and then it's in the revising that sometimes you notice things like, oh wait, there are certain repetitions that are happening naturally. What forms can I bring to this poem, which will help you bring out a bit more of the kind of almost subconscious quality of the poem. I think poems are things that need to be held lightly. And often if you have for me anyway, when I've got a conscious idea of, I want to write a poem about that says this, often you can tell, and there's no real, that idea of no surprises for the writer, no surprises for the readers. I think is very much a true idiom of writing. But I'm interested in form, but I'm also not afraid of trying a form, not succeeding it to the kind of more kind of traditional sense, and then just being like, okay, the form has helped me go this far. I'm just gonna add a little like rule of my own here. So I feel no way about doing that, and I know that again. I've heard people say like, oh, this person has tried to do this form with like a gazelle or something, and it's like, well, yeah, but I thought it'd be more interesting if I just threw my own idea in there, So we're allowed to do that as well. So yeah.
Two of the poems that you just read that were especially emotional were about your father, as your children's book too. There's obviously it's obviously a complicated subject matter for you, but an important one. Is there something about the way either that you have processed your relationship or that you think about your relationship with your father that you would like to relay to your audience, to all of us, through either your poetry or even through more direct means?
Wow, that's a lot in that. I think depending on when I was asked that question, I would probably respond differently. But like today, I'm just about to become a father myself, so I'm already feeling pretty differently. Like I'm transitioning into a kind of new understanding of him as a father, but also like as a person. Our parents are people ultimately, and I think particularly writing the poems about my dad, one of the most, I guess, real world revelations for me was sharing those poems with my mom, who read the book before it was published. And that, yeah, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. But yeah, it's hard to say this because it's kind of her story, but it's just interesting how tightly one can hold on to their grief and their pain, even when that person's no longer there. And so in some ways, I feel so lucky to be kind of practicing poetry that lends itself, or having a practice that lends itself to a kind of coping and a kind of understanding and searching deeper, as opposed to just having it and just walking around with it. And that's not to say that that's what my mom has done at all, but it's tricky. It's interesting, again, the way that when you write something, you create something and you show it to someone else outside of you, and when you get responses you're not ready for, you're like, oh, okay, all right, certain memories that you have, and then someone else that was also there was in a position to say, that's not how I remember it, or are you sure? And it's like, no. But then that's kind of, I don't know, that's interesting to me. But it's made me more protective of the space where I write poems in. So now I make sure like everything is done in my, like, I've done all my living I can with a poem before I show it, just especially someone that's close to me. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's.
I think it did.
Yeah.
It's a lot about understanding too.
Yeah, for sure.
And externalizing, right? Not
Yeah.
having it bottled up.
Yeah.
Here's a question from the audience: does living in a different country from the country of your birth impact your art?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've now spent quite a bit of time in different states in the US. Um, this is going to be so strange, probably to say. I haven't yet thought about how to articulate this. But one of the things I've been thinking about being here in the States is how it's so I can't. I don't know if I can say this properly because I'm like from the UK, which has its own complicated history with America and but I almost tempted to say I don't feel as much baggage here, like colonial British baggage, even though it is here. We're all speaking the British language. You know what I mean? So I want to be kind of careful of how I'm saying this. Nothing I'm saying now is fully realized. I'm still kind of working through that. But it is interesting that I feel kind of because it's also what's projected onto me. So I'm now in a place where up the road there's a bunch of like British flags, Union Jacks, and when I see them, I'm always like, what's being projected there, and what does that flag mean to the people here? And I was just saying how we were also in the place where the pilgrims. One of the places where the pilgrims like, kind of first landed in America. And just a few years ago, I was in the UK, in Plymouth, like where they took off. So now I'm remembering these two shores being like, man, this is wild. And how can I speak across that line? Sensitively, but also in a way that's imaginative. We're talking about imagining futures. So I'm trying to make sense of that at the moment, and I don't know.
How is your deafness articulated differently in the UK versus the US versus Jamaica?
Oh yeah, I mean yes, mainly because again the different history of all of those places, the different kind of access that you get in all of those places. So as it stands, America is the only place that has a higher education institution for deaf people. That doesn't exist anywhere else. That I know about. That kind of bothers me every day. Actually, when I think about that, and even this week, been talking a lot with Jeffrey about how deafness is this thing which I feel I've deepened my understanding of it through poetry, through thinking about it and reading about it. I've been trying to articulate that as part of myself. It's only part of my identity. It's not something, again, poetry just thing you have to hold lightly. If I squeeze it, I'll suffocate it, and then I won't be able to breathe myself. So it's only one part of who I am in the world. But it is an important part. And I mean, I know, because I mean, even like signing, so I don't know almost any American Sign Language, and I really wish I knew more. I've been trying to pick up little bits, but it's completely different to BSL. Even the alphabet is different, and so yeah, it's still a ongoing kind of journey with me, that, as everything is.
Amazing. Any other questions inside the room? Well, thank you so much, Raymond, for joining us. Thank you for experiencing your work with us, and for spending some time in the barn.
No, thank you. This has been a privilege to be here and to share this time and to meet Jeffrey as well, because I think we've got some projects that we want to manifest and put in the world, which would be great. So yeah, thank you.
And thanks everyone for joining us online. We really appreciate you taking the time on this Saturday afternoon. Don't forget to sign up at 20 Summers for future events. And again, thanks for joining us, and have a good afternoon.